Some truths don't shout, they wait. Harrison Ford didn't come to the park looking for justice. He came to sit, to remember, to be left alone. But one afternoon in Los Angeles, silence collided with suspicion and everything changed. It wasn't a speech that turned the world's eyes. It was a dog, a pause, and a man who refused to run. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The golden hour clung to Griffith Park like a secret, its soft light spilling through ancient oaks and pulling gently on the cracked stone path. The breeze barely stirred, and the air smelled faintly of pine, sun-warmed bark, and the dust of old memories. On a weathered bench near the eastern edge of the park, an old man sat still as stone. Harrison Ford, 84 years old, wore a faded brown jacket and a soft-brimmed hat pulled low, the brim casting a shadow over the map of years carved into his face. His eyes, though dimmed with age, still held the weight of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just sitting, letting the warmth of the afternoon settle into his joints like a familiar friend. Around him, the world moved, but carefully, like it wasn't quite sure what to make of him. A woman jogged past with her earbuds in, but her pace quickened as she approached. She didn't look at him. She just veered slightly off course, as if drawn by some invisible force of suspicion. A father pushing a stroller glanced his way and pulled his child closer, and a young boy no more than 6 stared openly as he passed, slowing for just a moment before his mother tugged his arm sharply and whispered something beneath her breath. The boy looked back once more, eyes wide with that particular blend of curiosity and confusion that only children have, and then he was gone. Harrison didn't move. He didn't return the looks, didn't explain himself. He'd stopped doing that decades ago. The bench beneath him creaked softly when he shifted his weight, and his hand rested on a small, worn leather notebook at his side, a kind of anchor, or maybe a relic. The birds still sang. The leaves still danced in the late sun. But for him, it all played like a distant soundtrack to a world that had long forgotten how to listen. From across the field, near the maintenance shed, a park security officer stood with a radio in hand, eyes locked on Harrison. His mouth moved, low and clipped, speaking into the radio before glancing back once more. A slow turn of the head, a furrow of the brow. Harrison noticed. Of course, he always noticed. The surveillance came in patterned side eyes, tightened grips on purses, the subtle hush in voices as he passed. It didn't matter how many planes he'd flown, how many people he'd helped, how many decades he'd earned. To them, now, he was just another old man sitting alone too long on a bench that didn't belong to him. A gust of wind rolled through the park, rustling leaves, scattering the faint sound of children playing somewhere far off. Harrison closed his eyes. For a second, just one, the sunlight washed over his face, and he felt almost invisible in the best way, not erased, but at peace, not watched, not questioned, just there, just allowed. But peace, he knew, was not something that stayed long for men like him. Not in this country, not anymore. He opened his eyes slowly and exhaled, steady and sure. The park was beautiful this time of day, but the beauty never protected him. He'd learned that truth long ago. It wasn't what you did. It wasn't what you said. Sometimes, all it took to become a problem was simply sitting still. The shadows were longer now, stretching thin across the cracked path like fingers reaching for something they could never quite hold. The bench where Harrison Ford sat hadn't moved, hadn't changed, but something in the air had. It was the kind of shift that didn't need sound to be heard. It was the kind that made birds pause mid-song and dogs lift their heads. And then they came. 3 men, walking from opposite sides of the park, with the kind of purpose that didn't ask questions, it gave orders. Officer Vaughn led the approach, swagger in his step, jaw set like stone. The kind of man who didn't speak unless he wanted control of the room the second he did. Behind him, Officer Whitaker moved slower, older, not uncertain but not entirely comfortable either. He looked like someone used to following a manual, not his conscience. And on the far left, Officer Jensen walked with a tight grip on the leash of a hulking German shepherd, sleek and alert. The dog's ears were upright, nose twitching, tail held low but tense. Its name was Ghost. Harrison felt them before he saw them. The rhythm of boots on grass, the silence that always followed uniform presence. He didn't move, didn't reach for anything. He just turned his head slightly, eyes lifting beneath the brim of his hat. Vaughn was already talking before he was close enough to be polite. "You've been here a while," Vaughn said, voice sharp and casual in a way that wasn't friendly. Harrison met his gaze, his tone calm. "Not bothering anyone." Whitaker hovered a few steps back, not speaking, not blinking much either. Jensen kept his hand on Ghost's harness, but the dog was already behaving differently, its posture tighter, but not aggressive. It wasn't pulling, it wasn't barking. Its eyes had fixed on Harrison, ears twitching as if straining to recall a forgotten sound. "You live around here?" Vaughn asked, but it wasn't a question. It was a measurement. "I do," Harrison replied. "Steady." Vaughn's lips tightened. "You waiting for someone?" "No." "Then what exactly are you doing?" Harrison paused, as if the question itself didn't make sense. "Sitting?" Vaughn smirked, like he'd expected that answer and was already tired of it. "You got ID?" Harrison nodded slowly, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Careful, deliberate, never rushed. He handed Vaughn a small leather wallet. Inside, his FAA pilot license, laminated and aged with the date of his certification. Beneath it, his SAG-AFTRA card yellowed at the edges, and tucked in between, a folded photo of a Bell 407 helicopter, faded but clear. Vaughn glanced over the contents, unimpressed. "So what are you, a retired actor pilot?" "That's supposed to mean something here. It means I've flown into more danger zones than you've walked through parking lots," Harrison said quietly. Whitaker's eyes flicked to Vaughn, but he still said nothing. Jensen shifted slightly, and Ghost made a low sound, not a growl, not a bark, something like a whimper wrapped in tension. Jensen looked down. "That's strange." "What's strange?" Vaughn snapped. "Ghost," Jensen said, tightening his grip just a hair. "He's reacting different." "He smells something," Vaughn asked, irritation rising. "Maybe our bench sitter's hiding something." Ghost let out a low huff and stared at Harrison, head tilted. Not hostile, just curious. Jensen narrowed his eyes, unsettled. Harrison looked at the dog and blinked, slowly. "I've seen that look before," he murmured. "Different war, different dog." Vaughn scoffed. "What? Now you're a soldier too." "No," Harrison said, voice flat. "Just someone who used to teach search and rescue dogs how to find the living." For the first time, Vaughn didn't have a comeback. The silence stretched a moment longer than it should have, until Whitaker cleared his throat. "Do we have a complaint, or?" he asked half-hearted. Vaughn ignored him. "You come here often every week," Harrison replied. "Same bench, same time. Never been a problem before." Vaughn's smile was thin and cold. "Well, maybe today it is." Ghost shifted again, letting out another breath that sounded too human. Jensen stared at him like he didn't recognize the animal at the end of his own leash. Harrison just sat, back straight, eyes calm, while the late sun burned against the back of his neck and the shadows stretched longer still. The quiet of the park had shifted. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves or the distant laughter of children anymore. It was heavier now, charged. Something about the way the wind paused, how conversations dimmed near the bench, how phones started to rise slowly at first, discreet, then deliberately. The air around Harrison Ford had thickened, not with sound, but with scrutiny. Vaughn was pacing now, tight circles like a predator, debating whether to pounce or posture. "You know," he said loudly enough for others to hear, We've had complaints about someone loitering here. People saying they feel unsafe. Harrison didn't look up. He didn't need to. He'd heard variations of that sentence his entire life. Unsafe. Suspicious. Doesn't belong. Translations of fear passed down through generations in polite code. He kept his gaze forward, hands folded over one knee, his hat still low. Funny, he said quietly. I thought sitting down was still legal. Vaughn chuckled, but it wasn't humor. It was warning. That sarcasm won't help you, old man. Whitaker glanced around now, uneasy. The park wasn't empty anymore. A couple stood near the bike racks, watching. Two teenagers leaned against a tree, phones in hand. Further down the path, a woman held her stroller in place, not moving, just listening. The murmur had started, low and buzzing. Something was unfolding, and people had begun to sense it. Ghost was restless. The leash in Jensen's hand stayed taut, but the dog's posture had softened. Not submission, not aggression, something else entirely. Recognition, memory. Jensen looked down again, frowning. Vaughn stepped forward. Here's the thing, he said, voice rising like an actor playing a role too big for him. We get called out when people feel uncomfortable. You understand that that's enough for us to intervene. Uncomfortable, Harrison echoed, almost a whisper. That word again. He leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the horizon. I've made people uncomfortable most of my life. For being too quiet, for looking tired, for being old, for having the nerve to exist in the open. A breeze cut through the trees, and somewhere, a bird fluttered away as if to escape what was coming. Then, from the edge of the small crowd, a little girl broke free from her mother's grasp. She couldn't have been more than 7. Blonde curls, dirt-smudged dress, a dandelion clenched in her tiny hand. She walked toward Harrison with the kind of innocence only children carry, the kind that doesn't recognize authority or bias or the threat of uniforms. She held out the flower. Harrison looked at her slowly, gently, and for a moment, his face softened in a way that age never could steal. But before he could say a word, the mother rushed in, grabbing the girl's arm sharply. No, sweetheart, she said through clenched teeth, eyes locked on the officers. We don't talk to strangers. Her voice trembled, but not with fear of Harrison, more with fear of what it would look like to let her daughter be kind to the wrong man at the wrong time. The girl glanced back, flower still in hand, confused. Harrison didn't flinch, didn't frown. He simply nodded, barely perceptible, like someone who'd seen this exact scene 100 times and didn't expect it to go any differently. A young man near the benches leaned to his friend and whispered, Is that Harrison Ford? His friend raised an eyebrow, angled his phone for a better shot. No way. But maybe. Jensen heard it. So did Vaughn. The ripple of recognition was spreading, subtle but irreversible. Not enough to protect him. Not yet, but enough to shift the tone. Vaughn's jaw tightened. I don't care who you think he is, he barked. This isn't about celebrity. This is about compliance. Whitaker took a step back. The word felt too loud now, too revealing. Ghost made another sound, this one sharper. Almost annoyed, and Jensen jerked slightly, unsettled. The dog wasn't playing along. Harrison exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. His voice, and when it came, was like a distant thundercloud, not loud, but unmistakable. Funny thing about silence, people think it means weakness, but sometimes it's just where truth gathers its breath. The teenager by the tree lowered his phone, eyes wide. Damn, he whispered. The crowd was growing, not just in number, but in presence. The air had shifted again, no longer just heavy with suspicion, but with awareness. The watchers weren't neutral anymore. They were witnessing. Vaughn could feel it too. The control he'd wielded like a baton just moments ago was slipping, second by second. But what none of them knew, not Jensen, Not Whitaker. Not even the dog was that the real shift hadn't come from the crowd at all. It had come from Harrison. And beneath that calm exterior, the storm had begun. The park held its breath. Even the trees seemed to freeze. Their leaves suspended mid-rustle like nature itself had decided not to intervene. The sun, once soft and golden, now burned a deeper orange, casting harsh lines across the pavement, cutting shadows like blades. The sounds of children, once distant but comforting, had vanished. What remained was silence, thick, heavy, the kind that comes before thunder. Vaughn's eyes were locked on Harrison, the muscles in his jaw twitching. His hand hovered just above his belt. But it wasn't a gun he reached for. It was power, or the illusion of it. "That's it," Vaughn said, voice clipped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's not complying." "Release the dog." The words shattered the air like glass hitting pavement. Jensen flinched. "Wait, he hasn't moved. He hasn't done anything." But Vaughn didn't even look at him. "I gave you a direct order. Officer." Jensen's grip tightened around the leash, knuckles whitening. Ghost stood ready, every muscle tense, ears locked forward, breath short and shallow like a runner before the starting gun. The dog was trained for this, to subdue, to neutralize, to protect, and yet it hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just enough for Jensen to whisper, almost to himself. "Something's wrong," Vaughn snapped. "Now." And Jensen, caught between command and conscience, did what he was trained to do. He let go. The leash slipped through his fingers, and Ghost became a missile. A blur of fur and muscle rocketed across the grass, paws pounding the earth in rhythm, jaws slightly parted, low growl building like a rising wave. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A woman screamed. A stroller toppled. The teenager with the phone shouted, "He's gonna kill him," but Harrison didn't move. Not a flinch, not a twitch. He simply stood, slowly, deliberately, no panic in his body, no fear in his eyes, just a calm, anchored rise as if standing to meet the sunset, not the jaws of a trained predator. His spine straightened, hands loose at his sides. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply looked at the oncoming force of instinct and training in violence with the eyes of someone who had already survived worse. And somehow, in that stillness, in that silence, the scene shifted, not physically, emotionally, spiritually, like the air itself recognized the weight of this moment. 10 feet away, Ghost's stride faltered, his growl cracked, his ears twitched, confused. He slowed, just slightly, but enough to send a ripple through the onlookers. Jensen stepped forward, uncertain, breath caught halfway between relief and terror. "What the hell?" he murmured. Vaughn's face twisted. Why is he stopping? Ghost was still coming, still fast, still fierce, but now there was something else behind his eyes. Not fury, not aggression. Something older, something quieter. Harrison took one small step forward, not toward safety, but into the path of the charging animal. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried across the distance like thunder rolling over still water. "It's me." The dog skidded, claws digging into grass, body twisting mid-stride, and then, impossibly, it stopped, inches from Harrison's legs. Ghost stood frozen, breathing hard, ears flattened slightly, tail twitching. Harrison didn't move. He just looked down, calm, steady. "You remember?" he said, quieter now. "Somewhere in there. You remember." The crowd was silent. Jensen's lips parted, speechless. Whitaker blinked, once, then again, unsure what he was seeing. And Vaughn stood paralyzed, his command unraveling like thread in a fire. The dog, trained for compliance, now stood still, unwilling to obey. The moment hung suspended, as if the world itself was waiting for a decision that would echo far beyond the fence lines of this park. And in that space where violence had been promised but not delivered, something else took root. Not peace, not yet, but something that looked a lot like it. And Harrison Ford, is still standing tall in the orange light of a trembling afternoon, became something more than just a man on a bench. He became the one thing Vaughn feared the most, a man who refused to run. For a moment, the world refused to move. Not a leaf stirred, not a voice dared rise. In that patch of grass bathed in late sunlight, Harrison Ford stood alone, and opposite him, a trained police dog known for precision and force stood frozen in place. Ghost's chest heaved, nostrils flaring, as if sniffing the past itself. His head tilted slightly, the growl had gone, replaced by something quieter, something ancient. Recognition. The sun struck just right, turning the space between man and dog into a stage lit with gold, as if the universe had paused to bear witness. Then, slowly, cautiously, Ghost took a single step forward. His head dipped. His tail gave the slightest twitch. Then he inched closer, eyes never leaving Harrison's. The crowd didn't dare breathe. Phones hovered in midair. A woman's hand clutched her heart. Vaughn stood stiff, lips parted but voiceless. Jensen was pale. Ghost stepped again, this time faster, not as a missile, not as a weapon, as something else, something no one trained him to be. He reached Harrison, stopped inches from him, then lowered his head slowly, reverently, and pressed it against Harrison's open palm. Harrison didn't move at first. He just looked down, eyes shining beneath the brim of his old hat. Then his hand, weathered and steady, curled around Ghost's neck, fingers sinking into fur like memory finding its way home. A low, whimpering sound came from the dog, the kind of sound no one had ever heard from Ghost, not in training, not in deployment, not once. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission, it was something closer to longing. And in the middle of that silent explosion of disbelief, Harrison whispered, "I knew it. I knew I'd seen those eyes before." He knelt slowly, not because of age, but because the moment called for reverence. The grass bent beneath his knee. The sun warmed the top of his shoulders like a benediction. Ghost followed, nudging into his chest, breathing in the scent of something deeply familiar. Harrison pressed his forehead gently to the dog's and murmured, "You've got his blood. You're from Blue's line, aren't you?" Jensen blinked. "What?" But Harrison wasn't speaking to anyone but the animal in front of him. "Back in Idaho," he said softly, "I pulled Blue out of a collapsed ravine during a training run. Broken ribs, broken paw. They said he wouldn't make it, but he did. And before they retired him, they bred him, trained his pups for K-9 service. You carry that fire, that heart." Ghost let out a breath, a soft huff that stirred the front of Harrison's jacket. Then he leaned in, pressing his body fully into Harrison's chest, tail giving a slow, steady wag. From the crowd, a ripple of astonishment rose, gasps, then murmurs, then stunned silence again. Someone dropped their phone. Another person whispered, "He's hugging him." Jensen took a cautious step forward. "He's never done that," he said, barely audible. "He's never reacted like this. Not with anyone." Harrison looked up at him, eyes clear but glistening. "Because you trained him to obey commands, but someone else trained his blood to recognize humanity." Vaughn's voice cracked through the moment, brittle and furious. "This is a stunt," he said. "Dogs don't just disobey. Something's wrong with him." "No," Harrison said quietly, rising to his feet with Ghost still leaning against his leg. "What's wrong is thinking this is just a dog and I'm just an old man." The wind picked up again, as if time had finally exhaled. Ghost stood tall now, but close pressed to Harrison's side, alert but calm, tail swaying. Jensen stepped back. Whitaker stared at the dog, then at the man. And for the first time, the badge on his chest looked like a weight he didn't know how to carry. The balance had shifted, not with fists, not with volume, but with the undeniable truth of a connection that couldn't be ordered, faked, or ignored. And in the heart of that sunlit square, where aggression had been commanded and obedience expected, a dog chose something else: loyalty, memory, recognition, the kind of memory that travels through blood and scent and soul, the kind of memory that doesn't ask for permission. And as the crowd stood stunned and Vaughn stood powerless, Harrison Ford placed a steady hand on Ghost's head and simply said, "Welcome back, partner." The silence that followed was not the kind that begged to be filled. It was the kind that demanded reverence. Ghost sat beside Harrison now, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as a sentinel, loyal, composed, and strangely gentle. The crowd stood frozen in that golden bubble of disbelief, unsure what they had just witnessed, but certain they would never forget it. And then, from the back, something shifted, a murmur, a rustle, a subtle opening in the sea of onlookers. Slowly, a man emerged. He moved with deliberate effort, supported by a carved wooden cane. His silver hair swept back like a curtain of time itself. His face bore the lines of someone who had spent his life behind cameras and under spotlights. But today, he wasn't there to direct anything. He was there to remember. Jack Kaplan, a name whispered with reverence in the film world, a director whose work had shaped decades. He paused at the edge of the circle, eyes locked on Harrison, his mouth set not in disbelief, but recognition. "That's him," Kaplan said, voice graveled with age but steady as bedrock. "That man saved my life." All eyes turned. Vaughn stiffened, suddenly alert. Jensen's brow furrowed. Whitaker squinted as if trying to place the face he should have already known. Kaplan stepped forward. 35 years ago. We were filming in the Sierras. A chopper went down. Engine fire mid-air. We lost altitude fast. He took another breath, the memory raw in his throat. Everyone panicked. Crew scattered. I was trapped. Smoke thick as hell. And then this guy, this carpenter turned pilot, pulled me out with one arm and flew us to safety in a second chopper. He fixed himself. He pointed at Harrison. Didn't ask for credit. Didn't stick around for press. Just flew off. Back to some set-building tool shed like nothing had happened. The crowd began to murmur. Someone said, "I remember that story." Another added, "They said the pilot disappeared." Kaplan's voice cracked slightly. "He disappeared because he never wanted the spotlight. But you tried to throw a dog at him today." Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. Jensen took a full step back. Ghost remained still, pressed to Harrison's side like a living monument. Harrison didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any defense. Kaplan turned toward the crowd. "You know how many people this man's helped, quietly off camera." When no one was looking, he shook his head. "He's been in more disaster zones than the agencies assigned to them. Flown supplies in hurricanes, pulled hikers out of ravines, helped rebuild barns, schools, shelters, never once with a press release." Someone whispered, "Why doesn't anyone know this?" Kaplan's answer came quick. "Because he never asked to be known. He just did the work." Vaughn tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Whatever justification he had rehearsed, whatever script of authority he clung to, it unraveled under the weight of living truth. The badge on his chest looked smaller now. The leash in Jensen's hand hung limp. Whitaker looked down, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. The energy of the crowd shifted. Not loud, not angry, just aware. Aware that the man they had almost watched be taken down by force wasn't just someone important. He was someone good, and worse. They had almost let him be erased. Again, Kaplan stepped closer and placed a firm, weathered hand on Harrison's shoulder. "You never wanted credit," he said, almost tender now. "But today, you're going to get it. Not because you asked, because we owe it to you." Harrison nodded once. Barely. Ghost leaned into him like a quiet exhale, and in that circle of sunlight and memory, the narrative began to crack. No longer about control, no longer about compliance. This was about a man who built things, who saved people, who gave more than he ever took. And the only thing he ever asked in return was to be left alone. The sun had dipped lower now. Its light stretched across the park like stage lights before a monologue. Harrison Ford stood still, his shadow long behind him, cast over grass and stone, over truth and shame. The crowd encircled him in silence, faces held in awe, remorse, or both. Before him stood three officers, each one smaller than they had been an hour ago, not in height, but in posture. Ghost sat at Harrison's side, calm as a statue, breathing slow, steady, eyes alert but soft. The leash lay untouched in the grass, forgotten. Vaughn shifted his weight, jaw clenched, waiting for some chance to salvage control. Jensen looked to the ground. Whitaker's eyes flicked between the crowd and the man they had misjudged. And then Harrison spoke. "I didn't want to be standing here," he said, his voice rough with age but strong enough to still the wind. "But you brought me here." He took a step forward, slow, not as a threat, but as a reckoning. "I came to sit. That's it. Just sit. Breathe a little. Remember some people I lost. Maybe feel the sun on my face without being told I don't belong under it." His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It carried because it came from deep a place lined with silence and survival. "You see this dog," he nodded to Ghost. "You all trained him to attack, to protect, to obey. But he did something none of you did today. He remembered, not orders, not procedures. He remembered me, not because I told him to, because his blood did." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some were tear-streaked, others were red with embarrassment. A few, like Vaughn, still bristled with the refusal to learn. "You didn't stop to ask who I was," he continued. "You didn't ask what I'd done, where I'd been, who I might have saved. You looked at my age and my stillness and saw a threat. You looked at my silence and called it suspicion." The wind stirred gently, and somewhere a phone clicked, trying to catch the moment without disturbing it. "I've built homes. I've flown into fires and hurricanes. I've pulled strangers out of wreckage. Not for thanks, not for applause, but because it was right. And today, when all I wanted was a piece of peace, you tried to take even that." He looked straight at Vaughn now. "And what did you bring to this park today? Officer authority, fear a leash. You were ready to turn this animal into a weapon, not because I did something wrong, but because you needed to feel right." Vaughn opened his mouth but said nothing. His badge suddenly felt like a mirror, reflecting more than he could handle. "The world doesn't need more men barking commands," Harrison said. "It needs more men willing to ask the quiet ones why they're sitting alone." Ghost let out a low sound, something between a breath and a rumble, and rested his head against Harrison's leg. A child near the front began to clap, once, twice, before her mother placed a trembling hand over hers. But the message was already echoing, not as applause, as awakening. "I'm not here to be your example," Harrison said, looking beyond the uniforms to the dozens gathered behind them. "But if you learned anything today, let it be this: truth doesn't wear a name tag, dignity doesn't show up on cue, and sometimes the only thing louder than a siren is a dog remembering who you really are." He turned to Jensen. "You trained him well," he said, nodding at Ghost, "but someone long before you taught him how to see." Then to Whitaker, he added, "You didn't stop it. You didn't start it. But you watched it happen. Don't let silence be your habit." He looked out one last time across the park at the faces, the phones, the guilt, the reverence, and ended with a voice that no longer needed to push. It simply delivered. "You don't have to believe me. I've lived long enough that I don't need anyone's permission to be real. But if a dog can remember my humanity, you don't have an excuse to forget it." And just like that, he stepped back into the sunlight, Ghost at his side, And the silence that followed wasn't out of shock. It was out of respect. The sun shone brighter that morning than it had in days, casting long golden streaks across Griffith Park like it was trying to remember what warmth felt like. The bench was still there, but something about it had changed. It wasn't just the new polish on the wood or the small garden bed someone had quietly arranged nearby. It was the plaque bolted clean to the center slat, words etched into steel with quiet defiance. In honor of those who sit, not to be seen, but to remember. And below that, smaller, just a whisper in metal. Harrison Ford, human, witness, builder. The crowd today was smaller, younger. A group of fifth graders sat cross-legged in the grass, squinting into the light, notebooks in laps, pencils tapping knees. Their teacher stood off to the side, arms folded, smiling like someone who knew her students were standing in front of something bigger than history. It was something still breathing. Ghost lay beneath the bench, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. He didn't wear a vest, no badge, no leash, just a red cloth tied loosely around his neck, faded at the corners, almost ceremonial. A few of the children had reached out to pet him earlier, and he hadn't moved except to wag his tail once, slow and steady, as if approving their gentleness. On the bench above him, Harrison sat, hat tilted forward, one hand resting on the same notebook he'd always carried. He wasn't here to teach, but somehow, that's what he always ended up doing. One boy finally broke the quiet. His hand wasn't raised. He just asked it like he couldn't hold it in anymore. "Are you the man in the video?" Harrison looked down at him slowly, eyes soft beneath the brim. He didn't answer right away. He let the breeze pass first, as if giving the park its turn to speak. Then he said, "No." A pause, a faint smile. The man in that video was just someone who wanted to be left alone. The boy blinked, but he stood up. He said stuff. He was brave. Harrison nodded. Only because he had to be. Sometimes silence is strength, but sometimes silence is how they erase you. You don't get to choose which, until the moment comes. The teacher scribbled something in her notepad. Another student leaned over to whisper to her friend, "I think he's way cooler than he looks." Ghost stirred, adjusting slightly, pressing closer to the bench's leg like even he knew this place wasn't ordinary anymore. Nearby, two joggers slowed down, glanced at the plaque, exchanged glances, and jogged on a little quieter than before. A woman placed a small flower at the base of the bench. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. What had happened here had already spread beyond the park. The footage of Ghost halting mid-charge had gone viral in hours. Not because of shock value, but because of recognition. It was the first time many had seen silence win. The first time stillness had told the loudest truth. Interviews were offered, honors extended. Harrison turned them all down. Except one, he allowed this class to come, not to tell them what happened, but to let them see where it happened. And maybe, if they sat long enough, listened closely enough, they'd hear something bigger than the story. They'd hear the pause between injustice and resistance, the breath before someone rises. The boy who'd asked the question before raised his hand this time. "Do you think we'll ever need to do what you did?" Harrison looked out at the horizon, eyes tracing the sky like an old pilot checking for wind. "I hope not," he said. "But if you do, don't raise your voice to be heard. Just stand. Let them see who you are." That's enough. As the children stood to leave, Ghost rose too, stretching, tail sweeping the grass. Harrison stood slowly, knees stiff, but proud. One little girl lagged behind. She pointed at the plaque. "Is that really you?" He looked at her gently. "That's just a name," he said. "The story belongs to everyone who watched." And as they walked away, the bench remained. Not just a place to sit, but a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is nothing at all. Just sit and wait until the truth is forced to stop running. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.